argument that have been passed in matches 4 decimal digits from the start of the string to the end of the string, then go ahead and set it. Otherwise, do not. Unfortunately, and not to digress here, but if there's in fact an error in this scenario, how do I signal the error to the user with this setter method? What's that?
Nothing at all.
Nothing at all?
Well, currently you don't do anything.
So right at the moment I do nothing, right? This apparently is some kind of void method who does something but doesn't necessarily return a value. But this is kind of an error if the user types in foo instead of a number. So what are my available techniques for signaling an error? Yeah, Carl.
You want to go with like try exceptions.
Okay.
Or you can go with returning like a nonsense value that you can cache inside the function that calls the function.
Okay, that you could cache inside of the function that, what do you mean by that latter phrase?
So you could return a nonsense value that
Okay.
the function that calls set year knows.
Yes, okay. So you could return some sentinel value, and very common in PHP, as you might have seen in the documentation, is to return false quite a bit. Sometimes null, but generally false signifies errors. Or you can throw exceptions, and exceptions, even though we haven't talked about them much in this class, we'll see them a little bit in Objective-C, but you could do something like else, throw, new, and this is the simplest of exceptions to throw. This is not all that useful because it doesn't actually have an error message associated with it. But know that you can create an exception object in PHP and actually throw some kind of special exception object inside of which will include, somewhat automatically for you, the line number where the exception was thrown, the file where the exception was thrown, plus a custom error message and or code that you might want to provide. So this is one approach as well. And so which one's right? To be honest, exception throwing is not all that common in PHP, though it does depend sometimes on the library you're using. So returning something like false is pretty reasonable. In this case, we could return true, although it might be useful to instead actually return the year itself, just because, and there's this notion of chaining where you might want to get back this very value that you passed in. So we have a few options here. But the short of it is that now that we have setters, we have the ability to maintain data integrity, right? We can ensure that we're only setting it to some legitimate value. But this is kind of a mess, right? I cut us short a moment ago and said, fine, just name and year. But imagine if we had let that conversation, the volunteering of ideas continue, and we had not just name and year, but dorm and phone number and email address. Right, this very quickly starts to devolve into what kind of experience? It's a whole lot of copy-paste, right, essentially. Or it's a whole lot of tedium where you're writing the same kind of boilerplate code again and again and again. So how do you avoid this? Well, in short, you might not necessarily. If you do have custom validation that you want to impose on different fields, you maybe can't avoid all of this. If you're actually using a library or something called an ORM, and to some extent something like CodeIgniter or some of the frameworks you might have vetted for Project 1, you can tell the libraries to do this for you, whereby you say, this is an email formatted field, this is a numerically formatted field, but the only takeaway there is that someone else has gone through all the trouble of writing those kinds of validation methods. But if you're not familiar, know that PHP does provide some fundamentally different ways of implementing these same ideas, which might be good, might be bad, depending on the context, but PHP provides some things called magic methods. And you can actually implement a method inside of a PHP class called __get. A very common convention in PHP in most languages is that the compiler or interpreter reserves for itself anything named with __. The idea being you should never do that. Using a single underscore is fine. Double is generally bad. So in this case, this is actually a really useful thing because I could do something like this. Switch on name, and I could have a case like case name. And then I'm going to do something, break. And then I'm going to have a case year. And then I'm going to do something, and then break. And then that's it. So __get, as you might be inferring, is a magical method, that's literally what PHP calls it, that is invoked anytime you try to access a data field. And let me go ahead and now I'll save this file so that I can post it later. I'm going to go ahead and delete all of these getters and setters that we defined a moment ago. And what you can now do is something like this. Some stuff. And now I can do echo s name. So the mere fact that I'm echoing or trying to get the value of s arrow name is going to try to access a field that apparently, according to my definition up here, and actually let me do this a little further. Let me delete these for the moment. It doesn't exist, right? This class has been so whittled down that there's no mention of name, publicly or privately. There's definitely no method called name. All there is this magical method. So what PHP will do is that when you do access a field like S arrow name. If it doesn't exist, it will call for you this magical method, which if you have implemented, you can then exercise control over exactly what's returned. So in this case here, I could do something like, well, ideally I just want to return something like this name, but what I can actually do in something like this is I can say private properties, and I can declare this as, for instance, an array. And then what I can do is this properties, quote unquote, name. I can essentially have a secret storage container that stores all of these fields, if only to eliminate a lot of the boilerplate code that I would have had to write again and again and again and again for all of these getters, which are almost all identical if all they do is return this arrow something. So this is perhaps an elegant solution to that problem of code duplication, but the setters can be implemented similarly. And if you do implement them in this way, you would do public function underscore underscore set name and a value. And I know that it takes those two arguments just from the documentation. And in here, I would then have to decide based on the name how and where to set that field. And so realize this is one approach that's available to you. So frankly, this is one of the sexier features of PHP that allows you to lessen the amount of code that you have to write while still providing some fairly basic functionality. And there's a bunch of others in addition to those. Yeah, Carl.
Instead of method, we just have $s arrow name equals.
Exactly. So what's nice about PHP is that if it realizes that you are writing code like this, S arrow name gets something, the mere fact that you have the arrow on the left and the assignment operator on the right, it's going to invoke for you underscore underscore set magically, as they say. So there's one thing worth noting here is that we're using this setter, and yet I have an opportunity right from the start to initialize this student object. In fact, that might be much more appropriate if you never really want empty dataless student objects to exist in memory. You don't want to use setters per se. How else can you pass in values or default values to objects? Yeah, yeah, so you have constructors, right? And so in PHP, unfortunately, you can only explicitly define one constructor function, one constructor method, because in PHP you can't override methods' names by having a foo method that takes one argument and then another foo method that takes two arguments, which you can do in other languages like Java and the like. You can achieve that same functionality, but not as cleanly. So for now, let's just assume that I'm going to implement public function underscore underscore construct, and I can specify values to take. I can do something like name, and I can take year. And then here, let's skip data validation for the moment. Let's just do this name gets name, and this year gets year. And let's roll back to the original version, whereby, you know what, I'm just going to explicitly say we have a private name and a private year. So here's my construct, and what's good about this model now, whereby I can call the constructor as follows. Instead of new student, I can instead say David, comma, 1999, close, paren, or something like that. What's advantageous now about introducing this third magical method? Magical only in as much as it starts with underscore underscore. Here, yeah.
Well, I mean, it just makes it a little bit more efficient. You don't have to go in and set the properties. Just passing those arguments.
Perfect. So in this way, it's a little more efficient in that you don't have to, one, instantiate the object, two, go ahead and set the actual properties, and also, as I suggested earlier, it also, if we now eliminate the setter method, which we've already, if we eliminate the setter method, here, now there's no way for a dataless student object to exist, because when you instantiate this student object now, you have to provide those values. And in fact, the interpreter will yell at you if you try to just instantiate a student object without passing in any arguments or the wrong number of arguments. So that's a plus. What else does this allow us to do? Well, similarly, could you put some kind of data validation here? Although the downside here is that it's typically not good practice for constructors to throw exceptions or the like. And so there's some less obvious ways of handling errors, potentially. But also, how does this approach to constructors maybe not scale? Right? We're also we're skimping on what a student is for the sake of discussion. But what's the logical extension of this approach? Yeah?
You might get a constructor with 20 arguments.
Right. It's going to get a little atrocious once we give students like email addresses and phone numbers and dorms and home addresses and all of this. And my God, then you have to be mindful of the order. And so in terms of backwards compatibility and agreeing with your partner or some company as to what your API is, you can't tomorrow change the order of name and year just because you decide a little anally that you prefer it the other way, because their code, of course, is now going to break. Any method call that said foo, comma, bar, they're going to have to change to bar, comma, foo. And similarly, if you keep adding it and adding to this comma separated list, you can at least be backwards compatible like this. You can say, you know what, we're going to support an email address, but just in case you're using the old version of the API, we're going to give it a default value of false. So PHP does have this ability to assign default values so that you can still call this constructor with 2 arguments,